The widow faints in the arms of a stranger at the matchmaking ceremony, not knowing he's a duke. The widow's knees buckled in the overheated hall. As she fell forward, strong hands caught her before she hit the floor. She opened her eyes to find herself cradled against a stranger's chest. Half the room staring, her mortification complete. What she didn't know was that the plainly dressed man holding her was the Duke of Arden himself. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of second chances and hidden identities, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, courage, and Victorian romance. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it brings a smile to my face. 1. Mrs. Eleanor Ward stood at the edge of the hired hall, her fingers gripping her reticule so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The matchmaking event was exactly as horrible as she'd imagined. Anxious mothers circled like hawks. Stiff gentlemen shifted from foot to foot, looking anywhere but at the women arranged like goods on display. Mrs. Abernathy, the matchmaker, moved through the crowd with determined cheerfulness, calling out names and pairing people for introductions like a general arranging troops. Eleanor was 28 years old, a widow, and utterly desperate. Her late husband's sister had pushed her to attend, and Eleanor had run out of reasons to refuse. The cottage she lived in wasn't truly hers. The small allowance she received depended on her brother-in-law's goodwill. If she didn't remarry soon, she'd lose everything and be forced to move in with Henry Ward and his disapproving wife. The thought made her stomach turn. She'd worn her only decent dress, black silk that was just slightly too tight because she couldn't afford alterations. She hadn't eaten properly all day. Nerves had stolen her appetite that morning, and by afternoon there'd been no time. Now the hall felt suffocating. Too many bodies, too much heat, and her corset laced tighter than it should have been. Poor thing, a voice whispered nearby. Eleanor's ears caught it despite the noise. She's past her prime, isn't she? Only here to catch whatever widower. Can't get anyone better. The younger woman who'd spoken giggled with her companion. Eleanor's cheeks burned. She focused on breathing, on staying upright, on not showing how deeply the words cut. Mrs. Abernathy's voice rang out across the room. Gentlemen, I must remind you that widows, while experienced in managing households, are naturally less in demand than fresh brides. However, they do bring certain practical advantages. The words hit Eleanor like a slap. Used, second-hand, unwanted. The room tilted. Eleanor reached for the back of a nearby chair, but her fingers only grazed the wood. Her vision narrowed to a pinpoint of light. The voices around her became muffled and distant. She felt herself swaying, the floor rushing up to meet her. Then strong hands caught her. Someone had stepped forward at exactly the right moment, catching her before she collapsed completely. The hands were steady and sure as they lowered her carefully into a chair. Around them, teacups clattered. Women gasped. Someone dropped a plate. Give her space, a male voice said calmly. She needs air. Someone fetch smelling salts. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. She found herself half leaning against a man's shoulder, his face close to hers. He had kind eyes, dark hair, and wore plain but well-made clothing. He looks like a modest gentleman, or perhaps a tradesman. Nothing about him suggested wealth or status. "Are you with us, madam?" he asked quietly. Eleanor tried to sit up properly, mortification flooding through her as she realized half the room was staring. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. It's quite all right." His voice was steady, reassuring. "The room is very warm, and I suspect you haven't eaten today." Mrs. Abernathy appeared beside them, fanning herself frantically. "Oh, Mr. Hale, I'm terribly sorry for such a scene. Mrs. Ward, are you quite well? Should we send for a doctor?" "I'm fine," Eleanor managed, though her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "Just a moment of foolishness." The stranger, Mr. Hale, studied her face with concern. "Have you eaten anything today?" Eleanor tried to summon a smile. Apparently not enough to stay upright, it seems. Something flickered in his expression. Not pity or disgust, but genuine amusement. A small, real smile touched his lips. "Then perhaps you should remedy that before attempting any more introductions." Mrs. Abernathy fussed over Eleanor, helping her to her feet and guiding her toward a quieter room at the back of the hall. As Eleanor walked away on unsteady legs, she glanced back once. Mr. Hale was still watching her, not with the calculating look of the other gentleman, but with something that looked almost like curiosity. In the quiet room, Eleanor sank onto a settee and pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. She'd fainted. Actually fainted, like a character in a bad novel, in front of everyone. In front of eligible gentlemen who would now see her as weak and ridiculous. She vowed never to faint in public again. Back in the main hall, the man Eleanor knew as Mr. Hale stood alone near the window. His real name was Thomas Hale, but his full title was the Duke of Arden. He'd come to Mrs. Abernathy's agency without fanfare, using only his family name, to observe her methods before sponsoring her charity ball. He was tired of being hunted for his title, tired of false smiles and calculated charm. The entire afternoon had felt artificial, every word carefully chosen, every gesture rehearsed, until the widow collapsed. That had been real. Her embarrassment, her attempt at humour despite obvious distress, the way she'd met his eyes without simpering or calculating. It was the first honest moment he'd witnessed all day. Thomas looked toward the door where she'd disappeared and felt something stir in his chest. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition that here was someone who understood what it meant to wear a mask. He didn't expect to see her again. Women like that, respectable widows with limited means, tended to avoid returning to scenes of public humiliation. But Thomas found himself hoping he was wrong. 2. 4 days later, Eleanor stood outside Mrs. Abernathy's townhouse, debating whether to turn around and go home. The matchmaker had sent a note inviting her to an afternoon tea for promising candidates, a more relaxed gathering than the disastrous ceremony. Eleanor had spent 2 days deciding whether her pride or her financial situation was stronger. Her empty cottage and Henry Ward's increasingly pointed letters had made the decision for her. This time, she'd eaten a proper lunch. Her corset was laced more sensibly. She could breathe without her vision swimming. Small victories. Mrs. Abernathy greeted her at the door with excessive enthusiasm. "Mrs. Ward, how wonderful to see you recovered. I do hope you're feeling better after that unfortunate incident." Her voice carried across the entire entrance hall, ensuring that everyone present would remember Eleanor's fainting spell. Eleanor smiled tightly. "Quite recovered, thank you." The drawing room was arranged for easy conversation, with small clusters of chairs and tables laden with tea and cakes. Eleanor recognized several faces from the ceremony, including the young women who'd mocked her. They whispered to each other and looked away when she met their gaze. "Mrs. Ward, allow me to seat you here, Mrs." Abernathy said, steering Eleanor toward a settee by the window. "Mr. Hale specifically requested that I ensure you were comfortably situated. He was quite concerned after your spell." Eleanor's cheeks warmed. Before she could respond, Mr. Hale himself appeared, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Mrs. Ward," he said with a slight bow, "I'm glad to see you looking well. I took the liberty of preparing your tea, but I wasn't sure how you take it. Sugar? Milk?" "Both, please," Eleanor said, surprised by his thoughtfulness. "And thank you for catching me the other day. I'm not typically so dramatic." He smiled as he handed her the cup. I don't believe that was drama. I believe that was an empty stomach and a too warm room conspiring against you. He settled into the chair beside her settee. Have you eaten today? I have, Eleanor assured him. Quite thoroughly, in fact. I'm unlikely to collapse on you a second time. I'm relieved to hear it, though I must say, you were quite easy to catch. Eleanor felt herself relax slightly. There was no mockery in his tone, only gentle humour. They fell into conversation more easily than she'd expected. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you're considering a contribution to her charity ball, Eleanor said. I am, Thomas replied carefully. I've recently inherited more responsibility than I expected. A large household, many tenants. The work of managing it all has been educational. You sound as though you didn't expect to inherit. I didn't, not so soon, at any rate. His expression grew sombre. My father passed unexpectedly. I found myself thrust into duties I'd only vaguely prepared for. Eleanor understood that feeling more than he knew. When my husband died, I inherited responsibilities without resources. It's a particular kind of difficulty. They talked for nearly an hour, not about weather or pleasantries, but about real things. Eleanor spoke carefully about her marriage, how her late husband had been proper and distant, more concerned with appearances than with truly knowing her. She didn't mention his name or the financial precariousness of her situation, but Thomas seemed to hear what she didn't say. In turn, he shared that he found the idea of being chosen for what he owned rather than who he was deeply uncomfortable. It's difficult to trust anyone's sincerity when they know what you bring to the table before they know anything about you. Then I have an advantage, Eleanor said lightly. I bring almost nothing to any table, so anyone who shows interest must at least find something about me personally tolerable. Thomas's expression softened. I suspect you bring far more than you credit yourself for. Across the room, Charlotte Briggs, Eleanor's friend and the local vicar's daughter, watched the exchange with interest. Charlotte had warm eyes and an observant nature. She'd known Eleanor since they were girls and had worried about her friend's forced gaiety these past months. Now she watched Eleanor actually laugh at something Mr. Hale said, and Charlotte smiled to herself. She'd have to tease Eleanor about this later. Meanwhile, in another part of London, Lady Margaret received a most disturbing piece of information from her maid. Her nephew, the Duke of Arden, had been visiting a matchmaking agency under a false name, meeting women of no particular standing. Lady Margaret set down her teacup with such force it cracked the saucer. This nonsense had to stop. She would visit Mrs. Abernathy herself and put an end to whatever foolishness Thomas had gotten himself into. The very idea of the Duke of Arden pretending to be a common gentleman and courting unsuitable women was enough to give her palpitations. She called for her carriage immediately. Back at Mrs. Abernathy's, the afternoon had grown late. As guests began to depart, Thomas approached Eleanor one final time. Mrs. Ward, I wonder if you might allow me to call on you next week, under Mrs. Abernathy's chaperoned arrangement, of course. Perhaps a walk in Hyde Park. Eleanor felt hope flutter in her chest, dangerous and unexpected. She'd sworn to herself that she wouldn't risk her heart again, wouldn't let herself be vulnerable to another man who might see her as merely convenient. But Mr. Hale didn't look at her the way her late husband had. He looked at her as though she were actually interesting. Only if you promise not to let me fall over again, she said, attempting lightness to cover her nervousness. His answer was immediate and serious. I'd prefer to prevent it altogether this time. There was something protective in his tone that both comforted and frightened her. Eleanor had learned that protection often came with a price. Still, she heard herself say yes. 3. Hyde Park on a Wednesday afternoon was chaos barely contained. Mrs. Abernathy had arranged for several of her matched couples to walk together under her supervision, which meant she spent most of her time herding people like an anxious shepherd while trying to maintain an air of dignified oversight. Children ran past chasing hoops. Dogs barked at squirrels. A gentleman's hat went flying in the breeze, causing a minor stampede as several people tried to catch it. Through it all, Mrs. Abernathy's voice rang out with increasingly frantic instructions about proper walking pace and appropriate conversation distance. Eleanor walked beside Thomas, grateful for his steadying presence amid the madness. She'd worn her second-best dress, dark grey instead of black, and felt almost normal. Does she always manage these outings with such, Thomas paused, searching for a diplomatic word, enthusiasm? I believe this is her first time chaperoning more than 2 couples at once, Eleanor said, watching Mrs. Abernathy attempt to redirect a couple who'd wandered too far ahead. She's discovering the limitations of her system. Thomas smiled. One might call it optimistic planning. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Eleanor found the courage to speak more honestly. Mr. Hale, I should tell you something about my circumstances. You don't have to explain anything you'd rather keep private. No, I think you should know. Eleanor took a breath. My husband wasn't a bad man. He didn't hurt me or treat me cruelly, but he was distant. Everything was about appearances, about doing things properly. I spent 3 years managing his house and being the wife he needed for social occasions, but I never felt as though he truly saw me. When he died, his estate went mostly to his brother. I have a small cottage and an allowance, but it's contingent on Henry Ward's goodwill. If I don't remarry, I'll eventually lose everything. She waited for Thomas to make some polite excuse, to suddenly remember an appointment elsewhere. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "Thank you for telling me. That takes courage." "It takes desperation," Eleanor corrected Riley. "I'm hardly the romantic figure of a woman freely choosing her own path." "Perhaps not," Thomas agreed, "but you're honest about it, which is more than most people at these affairs can claim." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My father was strict. He had very particular ideas about duty and proper behaviour. I grew up knowing exactly what was expected of me, and for a long time I did it all without question. But after he died, I realised I'd been living his life, not my own. Now I'm responsible for a large household and many tenants, and I find myself wanting to make different choices." Eleanor glanced at him. "What kind of choices?" "Honest ones, fair ones. Choices based on what's actually right, not just what's traditionally done." He met her eyes. "Including choosing a wife, because I genuinely like and respect her, not because someone decided she'd make a suitable duchess." Eleanor stumbled slightly at the word duchess. Thomas steadied her arm. "Are you all right?" "Yes, sorry, uneven path." Eleanor's mind raced. Had he misspoken? Perhaps he'd meant to say wife, not duchess. She must have misheard. They walked on, and Thomas pointed out a family of ducks by the pond. Eleanor let herself relax again. Their peaceful conversation was interrupted when a small boy ran directly into Eleanor's path, tripped, and fell hard on the gravel. He began to cry. His nursemaid was several yards away, struggling with a younger child. Without thinking, Eleanor knelt beside the boy. Her grey skirts immediately began soaking up mud from the damp ground, but she ignored it. "There now, let me see. Did you hurt your hands?" The boy held out scraped palms, tears streaming down his face. Eleanor pulled out her handkerchief and carefully dabbed at the scrapes, speaking softly until his crying settled to sniffles. The nursemaid arrived, thanking her profusely. When Eleanor stood, her skirts were thoroughly muddied. She looked down at them and sighed. "Well, that's going to be difficult to explain." Thomas held out his own handkerchief. "For your hands." She took it, touched by the gesture. Most men would have scolded her for being unladylike or making a scene. Her late husband certainly would have. Their walk was cut short when another gentleman in their party, a Mr. Pritchard, made a loud comment to his companion about the complications of second-hand wives and how widows required extra consideration because of their diminished market value. Eleanor froze mid-step. The words were clearly meant to be overheard, a warning to the other gentlemen present. Before she could gather herself to respond, Thomas spoke. His voice was calm, but carried clearly across their group. I find, Mr. Pritchard, that only small men measure a woman's worth by whether she's been previously married. A widow has survived loss, managed independently, and proven herself capable of devotion. Those seem like considerable strengths, not diminishments. Unless, of course, one is too insecure to appreciate a woman with experience and intelligence. Mr. Pritchard's face went red. He sputtered something about not meaning offence, then quickly excused himself and walked away with his own matched lady. Eleanor stared at Thomas, warmth flooding through her chest. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He was being cruel and stupid. Both things deserve correction. For the rest of the walk, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine that perhaps this time could be different. Perhaps this man saw her as someone worth defending. That evening, Eleanor received a visit from her brother-in-law. Henry Ward arrived without warning, let himself into her cottage, and stood in her small sitting room, radiating disapproval. I've heard you're spending time with some tradesman from Mrs. Abernathy's agency, he said without preamble. This is exactly the kind of embarrassment I worried about. The Ward family has a reputation to maintain, Eleanor. If you're going to remarry, it must be to someone respectable. Mr. Hale is perfectly respectable, Eleanor said quietly, trying to keep her temper. He's nobody, no family connections, no standing. If you insist on continuing this foolishness, I'll have to reassess your living arrangements. The cottage isn't yours, Eleanor. It's Ward property, held on sufferance. Don't make me regret allowing you to stay. After he left, Eleanor sat alone in the dark, the threat hanging over her head like a sword. Meanwhile, across London, Lady Margaret confronted Thomas in his study. She'd visited Mrs. Abernathy's office that afternoon and learned everything. A matchmaking agency? Her voice was ice. You've been parading around as Mr. Thomas Hale, common gentleman, meeting unsuitable women? Have you lost your mind? Thomas set down his pen carefully. I wanted to be seen for myself, not my title. You are your title, Thomas. You're the Duke of Arden. And now Mrs. Abernathy is dropping hints about her mysterious Mr. Hale to half of London. When the Ton discovers you've been playing at being ordinary, it will be a scandal. You must end this immediately. Choose a proper bride from a proper family and announce it formally, or stop this foolish game entirely. After she left, Thomas sat alone in his study, staring at the ducal signet ring on his finger. He should tell Eleanor the truth. He needed to tell her. But how did you confess to someone that you'd lied about your identity, when that someone had already survived one marriage built on appearances and deception? 4. The matchmaking reception was held in Mrs. Abernathy's largest townhouse, and it felt like a battlefield disguised as a social gathering. Mothers moved through the rooms with military precision. Young women positioned themselves strategically. Gentlemen clustered near the refreshments, looking hunted. Mrs. Abernathy was sweating behind her fan despite the cool evening. She needed at least one highly successful match from this event to justify her advertising. The pressure was making her even more effusive than usual. Eleanor arrived, feeling like a prisoner walking to her execution. Charlotte had helped her dress, lending her a dark blue gown that was nicer than anything Eleanor owned. You look beautiful, Charlotte had said firmly. Now go find out if Mr. Hale is as decent as he seems." Thomas arrived with every intention of pulling Eleanor aside and telling her the truth before anything else happened. He'd rehearsed what he would say. He'd prepared himself for her anger and disappointment. But Lady Margaret had other plans. She'd arrived early and taken Mrs. Abernathy aside for a private word. What she said, Thomas didn't know. But as he entered the main drawing room, he saw Mrs. Abernathy's face transform from anxiety to barely controlled euphoria. The matchmaker climbed onto a small platform intended for musicians and cleared her throat loudly. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a most wonderful announcement." Mrs. Abernathy's voice trembled with excitement. "I am deeply honoured to reveal that we have been blessed with the presence of His Grace, the Duke of Arden, who has been observing our methods with the intention of sponsoring our upcoming charity ball." She gestured dramatically toward Thomas. "May I present Thomas Hale, Duke of Arden?" The room exploded. Women gasped. Mothers whipped around to stare. Gentlemen began whispering furiously. And across the room, Eleanor went perfectly still. Thomas watched the moment she understood. Her face didn't crumble. She didn't make a scene. Instead, something closed off behind her eyes. Her expression went carefully, perfectly polite. She walked toward him, and people parted to let her through. When she reached him, she dropped into a flawless curtsy. "Your Grace," she said clearly, "I must congratulate you on your excellent performance." The words were arrows, each one precisely aimed. Before Thomas could respond, Eleanor turned to Mrs. Abernathy. "Thank you for a lovely evening. I'm afraid I must take my leave." She walked out with her head high and her spine straight, every inch the dignified widow. Thomas caught up with her in the corridor outside. "Eleanor, please, let me explain." She stopped, but didn't turn around. "There's nothing to explain, Your Grace. You wanted to observe common people without the complication of your title. I understand completely. It was very enlightening, I'm sure. That's not why I did it." Thomas moved to face her. "I hated being hunted for my title. I wanted to know if anyone would see me as just a man. I didn't expect to meet you. I didn't expect to care. But you did meet me, and you did care, and you still said nothing." Eleanor's voice was calm, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My first marriage taught me what it feels like to be an accessory to a man's public image. Being deceived, even for good reasons, is not a foundation I can build on again. I was going to tell you tonight, before anything was decided. But you didn't tell me before I began to trust you. That's what matters." She took a breath. "Excuse me, Your Grace. I need to go home." She left, and Thomas stood alone in the corridor, feeling as though he'd lost something precious before he'd fully understood its worth. Inside, Mrs. Abernathy was already moving on. She steered Eleanor's absence toward opportunity, introducing Thomas to other available ladies while privately panicking about losing her most eligible client. But she had a backup plan. Mr. Hewitt, a widower of comfortable means, had already expressed interest in Eleanor. He was older, quiet, and looking for a practical arrangement. A capable housekeeper who could manage his home and require little emotional involvement. Mrs. Abernathy sent a note to Eleanor the next morning, suggesting that Mr. Hewitt might be exactly what she needed. Stable, honest, uncomplicated. Eleanor read the note in her small cottage, surrounded by half-packed belongings. Henry Ward had made his position clear. She had 1 month to secure a respectable marriage or leave the cottage. She thought about Mr. Hewitt. She felt nothing when she imagined marrying him. No excitement, no hope, just less fear. When she thought about Thomas, Duke of Arden, she felt anger, but underneath the anger was warmth, laughter, and the memory of feeling truly seen by someone. Eleanor told Mrs. Abernathy she would consider Mr. Hewitt's offer. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret confronted Thomas in his study again. "This is what comes of playing at being ordinary. Now you've hurt some poor widow's feelings and created an unnecessary scandal. Choose someone else from the agency, any girl whose head is already turned by your title. Make it simple." Thomas said nothing. He didn't want simple. He didn't want a woman dazzled by his title. He wanted the widow who fainted, joked about it, and argued with him in the park. 5. Eleanor sat in her cottage 3 days later, preparing to give Mr. Hewitt her answer. A trunk sat open in the corner, half her belongings already packed. If she said no, she'd be moving out within the month. Henry Ward had been crystal clear about that. Charlotte sat beside her, drinking tea, and watching her friend with concern. "Do you want Mr. Hewitt?" Charlotte asked gently. "Or do you just want to stop being afraid?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "I don't feel anything when I think about him, only less panic. Is that enough? Is it enough for you?" "It might have to be. But when you think about the Duke..." Eleanor closed her eyes. "I feel angry, hurt, but also I remember laughing with him, feeling like he actually listened to me, feeling like I mattered as something more than a solution to someone's domestic needs." "Then perhaps you should tell him that instead of accepting Mr. Hewitt out of fear..." Before Eleanor could respond, someone knocked at her door. She opened it to find not Mr. Hewitt, but Henry Ward, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Eleanor, His Grace, the Duke of Arden, is in my drawing room. He wishes to speak with you. He came to ask for my permission to court you properly." Eleanor stared at her brother-in-law. "He what?" "He came formally, with his solicitor." Henry looked as though he'd swallowed something sour. "I had no idea your Mr. Hale was the Duke of Arden. If I'd known, I wouldn't have. That is, I should have been more. Eleanor, you should come." At Henry's house, Eleanor was shown into the drawing room. Thomas stood by the window. He turned when she entered, and something in his face made her breath catch. He looked tired, worried, honest. "Your Grace," she said carefully. "Eleanor, thank you for seeing me." He glanced at Henry. "Might we have a moment alone? With the door open, of course." Henry clearly wanted to refuse, but couldn't think of a socially acceptable way to deny a duke. He left, positioning himself obviously in the hallway where he could see them. Thomas waited until they were as alone as propriety allowed. "I came to apologize. Properly this time, without excuses. I hid behind my title for years, afraid of being wanted only for what I could provide. When I tried to step out from behind it, I still held back the truth. That was cowardly." Eleanor said nothing, waiting. "I've had my solicitor draw up papers. If you marry me, you'll have your own income, transferred into your name legally. A small property, also in your name, that cannot be taken from you if I die or if the marriage fails. Complete financial independence." Eleanor's eyes widened. In Victorian England, this was almost unheard of. Most women had no legal right to their own property or income after marriage. "I listened to what you told me," Thomas continued, "about feeling trapped, about being dependent on someone else's goodwill. I can't promise you'll never be hurt again, but I can promise you'll never be powerless. The settlement is yours, whether you marry me or not. It's already arranged." "Why would you do that?" "Because you deserve security that doesn't depend on anyone's mercy. And because I love you." The words came out simply, without rehearsal. "I love the way you speak your mind, the way you knelt in the mud to help a crying child, the way you rolled your eyes at me in the park. I want a partner, Eleanor, someone who'll tell me when I'm being foolish and challenge me to be better. I don't want a quiet ornament. I want you." Eleanor felt tears threaten. What happens when society whispers about your foolish choice? When they mock you for marrying a widow of no standing? Thomas smiled slightly. They already whisper about my stubbornness, my temper, and my dislike of London balls. Let them add one more thing. I'd rather be gossiped about with you than admired alone. You lied to me. I did, and I'm sorrier for that than I can properly express. I can't take it back, but I can promise I'll never lie about something important again. And I'll never make decisions that affect your life without including you. Those are promises I'm prepared to put in writing, if you need that. Eleanor looked at him. Really looked at him. Mr. Hewitt offered safety without warmth. Thomas offered risk, yes, but also respect, affection, the possibility of being truly known by someone. I have conditions, she said finally. Hope flared in Thomas's expression. Name them. You will never lie to me about something important again, ever. Agreed. I will never be left out of decisions that affect my life. I will have a voice in how we live, where we live, how the household is managed. Absolutely agreed. And if I faint again, you have to promise not to look so terrified. It's mortifying enough without your panic. Thomas laughed, real and surprised. I promise to maintain perfect composure while catching you. Eleanor felt herself smile despite the tears now falling. Then, yes, I'll marry you. He crossed the room and took her hands carefully, as though she was something precious. I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that, yes. See that you do. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Abernathy hosted a small engagement announcement at her office. She'd already mentally drafted 3 pamphlets about her ducal success. The room was crowded with well-wishers when Eleanor felt suddenly light-headed. Too many people, too much excitement, not enough breakfast. She swayed slightly. People nearby gasped. Eleanor raised one hand and said clearly, I promise not to faint this time. She gripped Thomas's arm firmly. He answered loud enough for everyone to hear, If you do, I'm quite well practiced at catching you, Mrs. Ward. Laughter broke the tension. Charlotte smirked from her corner. Mrs. Abernathy beamed. In the carriage home later, Eleanor leaned against Thomas's shoulder. I suppose I should be grateful I fell into the right stranger. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I've been grateful every day since. Eleanor looked out at the city passing by and realized that for the first time since her husband died, the future felt like something she'd chosen. Not something that had simply happened to her, but something she'd actively decided to build. With a man who'd catch her if she fell, and stand beside her when she didn't. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Your support helps us continue creating more stories of love, redemption, and second chances that matter. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our romantic stories. Click and discover more beautiful tales of courage and connection. With all our gratitude, Duke's Story.